I am going to speak directly to the situation in Niger, and I think that's appropriate talking about food insecurity because Niger is the country in West Africa that has most recently had what we might call either a crisis or a famine, and there has been a debate about that, and our position is that it really wasn't like the famines of the past. It had its own peculiar character, so we call it a crisis. But I think by looking at the crisis in 2005, we can learn certain features that are generically pertinent to the Sahel in a way, but also very specific to Niger's location, where it finds itself right north of a very large neighbor. And you'll see that Nigeria, as I said, it really does dwarf any other influence in terms of a regional influence on food security that Niger has. Niger is part of the Sahel. It does do an awful lot of business. It has the normal ties with, less with Chad, but more with Burkina and the other parts of West Africa. But you'll see that Nigeria alone, in terms of its population, Dr. May, you can probably confirm, Nigeria, I believe it has more population than the Sahel combined, and probably add up some of the coastal countries, and you still have the largest, in fact, a quite large population in Nigeria, one of the largest countries in the world. And you'll see that its ag production, 30 million, this is this year, that 30 million tons itself is larger than the ag production of all of the Sahelian countries combined, even adding again several of the coastal countries. So that bulk of people and that bulk of demand is a huge influence on the Niger market. And when you put that together with a burgeoning oil-based economy, with a lot of demand being generated from the oil revenues, you have a generated demand that is quite excruciatingly heavy on most parts of the Sahel, extending over into the west. The record food prices in Nigeria just had the effect of siphoning everything that wasn't bolted down in the Sahel. The prices were too hard to refuse. There was a movement of grain moving from the north, not only from Niger, but also from Burkina, from Mali. In effect, the Sahel was feeding Nigeria. And that led to record prices in Niger, as we saw. We also saw that the worst malnutrition was in Niger's most productive areas in the south. Those areas, when we look at them closely, we find that there are many issues that are driving a chronic malnutrition. That includes a lot of issues that are far beyond production of food and access to food. And they go into poor water quality, child care issues, a whole number of things, but they probably also deal with an increasing orientation towards the market. That people there are producing for the market, they're producing for a cash economy, they're taking out loans. The nature of their income is very seasonal. And that's probably not a good profile for continuing to feed your child all the way through the year. You have big bumps in the year when you will have money available, and you have other points when it will not be available. So we think that that's one of the explanations for why those areas continue to be very fragile and are becoming more so over time. But those high food prices were absolutely devastating to these populations down there that are oriented towards the market, are producing for the market, and have to buy a majority of their food. Almost everybody in Niger buys more than 50% of their food anyway. These areas, it's much more extreme. I think it's very important that we understand that the food crisis we saw in 2005 was probably not typical of what we saw in the past. It may not be typical of what we see in the future, but it may, in a way, be the real signature of what we are moving towards, more market-based issues. What should we do, therefore, for addressing food insecurity in Niger? I'm going to keep repeating that it's not simple. There is a limited amount of ag expansion that's possible. We believe, based on a study we did last year, that they have about reached the limits of their arable land. I've been talking about how difficult it is, but I really feel the need as well to indicate that there are certain features occurring, spontaneous, self-generated, farmer-led, that are very important to note. Based on some fairly good studies, we believe that about 250,000 hectares in Niger have been reclaimed in this manner, including the tops of plateaus that are basically lateritic soil that have been colonized for planting by women's groups. And you'll see the impact of policy, because basically a lot of the changes that have occurred in terms of regenerating the tree cover in Niger have been driven by a change in policy, as well as by the efforts of the individual farmers here. When you give the farmer the right to trim off a part of the tree, the farmer has a reason to keep that tree. When you don't give him the right to cut the tree, which the national law was, then the first thing they're going to do is at night when they need that tree, they're going to cut it. So by extending ownership of the trees have been protected. That's a change that occurred in about 1996. Now, improving food access. Food access is the key to poverty, and it's the key to food security as well. But, and I think I'm just echoing some of the things that Dr. May just mentioned, we've got broad and deep poverty. Despite some of the advances and the increases in production we've seen there, we still have one of the countries that is the poorest in the world, amongst the poorest in the world. You've got a huge population growth as well, one of the highest in Africa, I understand, and it is doubling the population on a regular basis. As well, you've got this huge issue that some of the other countries don't have to that degree, but still key in Niger is that you've got market integration occurring with Nigeria. Everything you produce, there will be more money for it down south. And so a lot of what you produce will be attracted down there as opposed to remaining in Niger. But the other thing to say is if you look at this in terms of food access, let's see the food production we saw and the trade that we've been able to measure, you'll see that per capita access has been remarkably steady and remarkably above a minimum threshold. So, you know, they've been fairly successful over the last 30 years, but we should not believe that that could possibly continue with the rate of population growth we see and with the limited resource base that the country is dealing with. Should we improve food utilization? Absolutely. As I was saying, poor water quality, malaria, all of the other things that people are subject to there. The World Bank actually says that about 50% or more of the malnutrition that we see in Africa is generally due to other than food consumption related causes. So if you want to get rid of malnutrition in Niger, it's not a matter of delivering more food aid. It's not a matter of producing a lot of food. And you know, our policies these days tend very much towards a broad growth in agricultural production. Well, that's good. That's a necessary prerequisite, but it doesn't necessarily reduce food insecurity because it's not shared. We also know that emergency safety nets, the food aid solution, is not a solution. It's a very temporary response, and it's not enough. And the difficult thing is that we have to have sustained attention to development funding or development in Niger. And I'm not saying that external funding is the answer. It generally isn't. It's a small input that pales in contrast to the amount of money that goes in there from remittances. So sustained attention to the development of the economy, to water sources, healthcare, education, you've got to have that if you're going to fundamentally resolve this question. The market, we can't get rid of it as much as we'd like to sometimes. You know, that big market on the south there is going to be a continuing irritant at certain moments in the Niger food security equation. But it's also potentially a part of the big solution.